Imagine the ground beneath your feet trembling with each thunderous roar, the kind that shakes your very bones and rattles the breath out of your chest. You're standing on the high ancient walls of Constantinople, walls that have shielded generations before you, walls that emperors once declared invincible. From this vantage point, you can see the horizon lit not by dawn, but by fire. Fire from enemy cannons that belch smoke and stone in a relentless rhythm, pounding the earth like the drums of fate. Below, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers stretch out like a sea of steel and banners, their chants rolling across the fields in waves of dread. The air itself is heavy, not just with the scent of gunpowder and burning oil, but with the weight of inevitability. For centuries, this city has been the heart of an empire, the last glittering jewel of Rome, and now, on this night, you know in your heart you may be one of the final defenders of a 1,000-year civilization. Your sword feels small in your hand. The prayers echoing from Hagia Sophia behind you feel both comforting and desperate, as if heaven itself might be asked too much. You are no longer merely defending stone and mortar, you are defending a legacy, a world, and perhaps, the very line between two civilizations. Every breath feels like borrowed time. Every heartbeat is a drum counting down the end of an age. Constantinople was no ordinary city. To the Christian world, it was the crown jewel, a city that had once been the beating heart of an empire spanning continents, a fortress of both faith and power. To the Ottomans, it was the ultimate prize, the keystone that would cement their dominance and prove their empire destined to eclipse Rome itself. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been tested and besieged. Armies of Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and even Crusaders had hammered against its gates, and each time somehow impossibly the city endured. Its double and triple layers of walls were legendary, its defenders feared, its resolve unshakable. Chroniclers called it the city of the world's desire, and rightly so. But by 1453, something had changed. Constantinople was no longer the flourishing metropolis of Justinian's day, it had become a shadow of its former self, a city reduced to perhaps 50,000 souls, most of them weary, poor, and clinging to the memory of better times. The empire it ruled had withered to almost nothing, just the city itself and a few scraps of territory. Yet still the wall stood. And that is what made it both irresistible and vulnerable. On the other side of those walls stood Sultan Mehmed II, a young man of 21, but already filled with an ambition that burned hotter than the fires of his cannon. He was not just coming with an army, he was coming with a vision, with gunpowder, with faith, and with the determination to bring down the city that had defied the world for a millennium. To understand the fall of Constantinople, one must first understand the slow, grinding decline that made this final siege inevitable. Once upon a time, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, was Rome's proud heir, the new Rome, a place of emperors draped in purple and armies that marched with iron discipline. Its emperors crowned themselves in Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, a masterpiece of domes and light that seemed to defy gravity itself. The empire was rich, cosmopolitan, a hub of trade where East met West, silk met silver, and ideas flowed as freely as gold coins in its bustling markets. But history is not kind to empires that believe themselves eternal. Century by century, piece by piece, Byzantium crumbled. External enemies chipped away at its borders. Crusaders, once allies, turned treacherous and sacked the city itself in 1204, leaving scars that never healed. Civil wars bled its strength further. By the 15th century, what remained was little more than the shell of an empire, surrounded on all sides by the rising Ottomans. It was a miracle the city even still stood. And yet, those walls, the Theodosian Walls, 3 layers thick, running nearly 4 miles long, still gave Constantinople the appearance of invincibility. To Europe, it was still the bastion of Christianity in the East. To its citizens, it was still Rome. And to Mehmed II, it was the last obstacle between him and greatness. The stage was set, an empire gasping its last breath, clinging to its walls, and a young conqueror with destiny in his eyes. This is where history teeters on the edge of memory and oblivion. For many, the story of Constantinople is not known in full. It is reduced to a date, a footnote, or a passing mention. But behind that date lies blood, fire, betrayal, and the end of 1,000 years of history. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the chants of the priests in Hagia Sophia, the thunder of cannonballs slamming into ancient walls, the cries of women and children praying for salvation as the city's defenders bled on the ramparts. These are not just stories, they are echoes echoes of people who lived, who hoped, who feared, and who fought knowing they might never see another dawn. The fall of Constantinople is not just about bricks and battlements. It is about human lives crushed beneath the wheels of history, about the arrogance of rulers who thought the past could protect them, about the hunger of a new empire rising from the ashes of the old. And here's the truth: if we do not remember, we lose them again. Their courage, their tragedy, their lessons, all vanish into silence. These stories vanish from memory unless we keep them alive. And that is why you must stay with me. If you crave history's forgotten truths, if you believe the past matters, if you want to uncover the blood-soaked realities that shape the world we live in, then subscribe now, because what happens next will shake you. Constantinople did not fall quietly. It fell with thunder. Spring 1453. The air in Thrace was heavy with dust and thunder as Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, set his gaze upon the walls of Constantinople. Though still so young, he carried himself with the gravity of destiny. To his men, he was not merely a ruler. He was the conqueror before the conquest was even won, a man convinced that God had chosen him to finish what centuries of armies had failed to achieve. Behind him marched an army like no other. Over 80,000 soldiers filled the fields around the city, their tents stretching like a sea of white and crimson, their banners fluttering against the sky. Janissaries, elite soldiers raised from childhood to serve the Sultan with unquestioning loyalty, stood in disciplined ranks, their faces hard, their weapons gleaming. Cavalry rode restlessly on the edges, while siege engineers prepared instruments of destruction never before seen on this scale. And in the heart of this arsenal, one weapon stood above all. A monstrous cannon, a creation of the Hungarian engineer Orban, so vast it required hundreds of oxen to haul it into place. It could hurl stone balls weighing over 600 pounds, each one capable of shattering the earth, the walls, and perhaps, the spirit of a city that had endured 1,000 storms. Inside Constantinople, the scene was altogether different. The mighty city that once rivaled Rome itself was reduced to a population of fewer than 50,000 souls, many of them old, poor, or weary from years of hardship. Its defenders numbered scarcely 7,000 men, not an army but a desperate gathering of soldiers, priests, monks, and foreign volunteers who had answered the call of faith. The last emperor, Constantine XI, stood at their head. Though he knew the odds were hopeless, he carried himself with the dignity of Rome's final guardian. Around him, Venetians and Genoese mercenaries manned the walls beside farmers, fishermen, and even teenage boys who had never held a sword until that spring. Their weapons were outdated, their supplies limited, their hopes stretched thin. Yet still, they stood behind the Theodosian Walls, massive, towering, layered fortifications that had protected their ancestors for more than 1,000 years. To many, those walls were more than stone. They were salvation itself. But salvation was fragile. Each day the cannons roared, and the ground shook as iron and stone smashed into the ancient defenses. Clouds of dust filled the air, mingling with smoke, ash, and the cries of men. Every impact carved new scars into the walls, scars that had to be repaired under the cover of night. Women, children, and monks worked by torchlight, hauling stones, mixing mortar, and patching breaches with their bare hands, praying all the while that morning would not bring the final collapse. The Hagia Sophia, once the shining beacon of Christian glory, was now filled with shadows and whispers. Candlelight flickered against golden mosaics as citizens prayed for a miracle, for the heavens to intervene, for angels to descend, for anything to stop the storm gathering at their gates. And yet, outside the city, the storm only grew stronger. Mehmed's army dug tunnels to undermine the walls, sending sappers crawling like shadows beneath the earth. At night, Ottoman troops launched sudden raids, trying to overwhelm the weary defenders. Fires broke out. Alarms rang. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, replaced with the endless rhythm of fear and exhaustion. Every dawn brought new bombardments. Every dusk brought new repairs. It was a war of attrition, of willpower against inevitability, of faith against firepower. And so the question hung in the smoky air, haunting every heart inside those walls. How long can faith hold against firepower? What happens when the walls that stopped the world's greatest armies finally tremble? For 53 days the siege dragged on. Cannon fire pounded the walls until the earth itself seemed weary of the noise. Food dwindled. Sleep was stolen by alarms in the night. The defenders patched walls with rubble and timber, patched wounds with rags and prayers. Each sunrise brought more smoke, more ruin, more dread. And yet, against all reason, Constantinople still stood. But then came May 29, 1453. The morning that would end an empire. Before dawn, the earth shook under the sound of drums, horns, and war cries. Mehmed had prepared for this day with ruthless precision. 3 waves of attack, each deadlier than the last, would crash against the walls until the city finally broke. The first wave came, irregular troops, thousands of men hurled forward to exhaust the defenders. They were poorly armed, driven more by fear of their commanders than by loyalty. Their purpose was simple: die on the walls, wear down the Christians, and expose the weak spots. The defenders rained arrows, stones, boiling oil. They fought with desperate fury, hurling ladders back into the ditches, cutting down men as they climbed. The first wave faltered, broken on the walls. Then the second wave advanced, disciplined Anatolian troops, better armed, better trained. They surged toward breaches in the walls, forcing the Byzantines into hand-to-hand combat. Steel clashed in the narrow gaps. For a moment the line held. Emperor Constantine himself rushed from post to post, rallying his men. His presence was fire, the last spark of Rome burning in mortal form. Yet again the defenders prevailed. The second wave, bloodied and broken, fell back. And then came the third wave. The Janissaries. Mehmed's elite. They moved in silence at first, their lines gleaming under torchlight, their steps steady as if guided by fate itself. When their advance began in earnest, the air filled with thunder, drums, chants, and the deafening roar of cannon. This was no ordinary assault. This was the hammer of history itself. The defenders, exhausted and bloodied, braced themselves for the storm. For a time the wall still held. But then came the moment of betrayal, or perhaps, a tragic accident that sealed the city's fate. At the northern section of the walls, a small gate, known as the Kirkoporta, was left unlocked. Whether through oversight, desperation, or treachery, no one knows. Ottoman troops discovered it, poured through, and raised their banner above the inner defenses. A cry went up, a cry that shattered what hope remained. The Turks were inside. Panic spread like wildfire. Defenders rushed to contain the breach, but it was too late. The Janissaries surged forward, flooding through the gap, pressing deeper into the city. Constantine XI, the last emperor of Byzantium, understood what this meant. He threw off his imperial purple, stripped himself of every sign of royalty, and charged into the melee with his sword drawn. Side by side with his men, he fought not as a ruler but as a soldier, striking down enemies until he was lost in the tide. No one ever saw him again. His body was never recovered. Rome's final emperor vanished into legend, a king who died with his city. The streets became rivers of chaos. Fighting broke out house to house, man to man, but the defenders were too few. The great bells of Hagia Sophia tolled for the last time as terrified citizens, priests, and children crowded inside, praying that the holy place would protect them. But prayers could not stop the iron. The doors were battered down, and the Ottomans stormed the greatest church in Christendom. Candles flickered one last time before being snuffed out by the tide of soldiers. After 1,100 years of defiance, Constantinople fell. And here is where history weighs on us most. Was the city doomed from the beginning, surrounded and abandoned, its empire long crumbled to dust? Or did fate turn on something as small as a forgotten gate, a single human mistake that allowed the flood to pour in? Tell me in the comments. Was Constantinople doomed from the start, or could history have turned out differently? When the sun rose on May 30, 1453, the world was not the same. The city that had once been the queen of cities, the citadel of Christendom, the last jewel of Rome, was gone. The Byzantine Empire, 1,000 years of emperors, councils, wars, art, and faith, had vanished overnight. Not with a gradual fade, but with a single, thunderous end. What centuries of decline had begun, Mehmed's cannons had completed in one final act of violence. The streets of Constantinople bore silent witness to the cost. Corpses lined the alleys, fires burned in abandoned homes, and the cries of the captured echoed through the once proud avenues. Thousands were enslaved, marched in chains to serve as spoils of war. Families were torn apart, lives shattered in a matter of hours. The Hagia Sophia, the heart of the city and the pride of Christendom, stood transformed. What had been a cathedral of heavenly light, filled with incense and hymns, was now claimed for Islam. The cross was taken down and the crescent raised. For the citizens of Constantinople, it was the final humiliation, the symbol of their faith turned into the crown jewel of their conquerors. And yet, out of destruction came transformation. For Mehmed II, the fall of Constantinople was not just a conquest, it was a rebirth. He entered the city not as a destroyer alone but as a builder. He declared it the new capital of his empire, renaming it Istanbul. To the Ottomans, this was not merely victory, it was destiny fulfilled. They had torn down the walls of the old world and built their eternal capital on its ashes. Istanbul would stand not as a ruin, but as the beating heart of one of history's greatest empires for centuries to come. But for Europe, the fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves far beyond its walls. The great trade routes that once flowed through Byzantium were now controlled by the Ottomans. Spices, silk, and goods from the east became more expensive, more difficult to obtain. In response, Europe looked outward, across the seas. It was the closing of one door that forced the opening of another. Within decades, explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama set sail, seeking new routes to the riches of Asia. In this way, the cannons at Constantinople inadvertently sparked the age of exploration, a movement that would reshape the globe forever. At the same time, the fall scattered Byzantine scholars, who fled westward carrying manuscripts, ideas, and knowledge preserved since antiquity. They brought with them the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle, and ancient science that had been safeguarded in Constantinople's libraries while much of Europe lay in the Dark Ages. Their arrival in Italy helped ignite the Renaissance, fueling an explosion of art, science, and philosophy that would change the trajectory of Western civilization. Thus, even in death, Byzantium's legacy lived on, not in empire but in the rebirth of human creativity and knowledge. And yet, there is no escaping the tragedy. A civilization that had once stood as Rome's proud successor was extinguished in a single dawn. The purple robes of its emperors were lost, its ceremonies silenced, its name reduced to memory. The fall of Constantinople was not simply the collapse of a city, it was the closing of an age. From that day forward, the Middle Ages were over. A new world had begun. And this is why we cannot let the story fade into a footnote. The fall of Constantinople is not just about stones and cannons. It is about lives, faith, power, and the relentless march of history. It is about how the fate of one city reshaped continents, belief systems, and futures. Like this video, share it and subscribe, because history is not just stories, it's the blood that shaped the world we live in today. History is more than dates and battles. It is a mirror. And when we look into the mirror of May 29, 1453, the message is chillingly clear. No wall, no fortress, no empire lasts forever. Constantinople had stood for more than 1,000 years. Its walls had repelled Arab armies, Bulgar horsemen, crusaders, and countless sieges. It was said to be invincible. And yet, in a single night, it fell. Power built over centuries can collapse in the blink of an eye. This is not just a story about cannons breaking stone. It is about how civilizations crumble when they mistake yesterday's strength for tomorrow's security. The Byzantines believed their walls would always hold, that their traditions would always protect them. But arrogance blinded them to innovation, and division hollowed them from within. The Ottomans adapted, modernized, and believed in their destiny, while Constantinople clung to its past. And in that imbalance, between vision and stagnation, the fate of the empire was sealed. The lesson stretches far beyond Byzantium. Every empire, every nation, every company, even every individual faces the same danger. The temptation to rest on old victories, to imagine that past glory guarantees future survival. Rome thought it was eternal. The British Empire thought the sun would never set. The Soviets believed they were invincible. And yet, like Constantinople, they too discovered that history shows no mercy to arrogance. But this is not only about politics or empires. It is about us. How often do we cling to our own walls, habits, assumptions, comforts, believing they will protect us forever? How often do we ignore change because we think the world will bend to us, instead of us adapting to it? The fall of Constantinople is not only a warning to kings and emperors. It is a warning to all of us, adapt or perish. And yet, within the tragedy lies hope. Though the empire fell, its legacy endured. The fleeing scholars lit the fire of the Renaissance. Its fall pushed Europe toward exploration, discovery, and the reshaping of the modern world. Constantinople reminds us that even in collapse, legacies can outlive destruction. What matters is not how long you last but what you leave behind. So here is the universal truth. Civilizations rise and fall, but ideas endure. Walls may crumble, empires may vanish, but knowledge, art, courage and innovation can ripple forward through centuries. The Byzantines are gone, but their wisdom, their culture, their influence still echo in our world. The fall of Constantinople forces us to confront a hard reality. One day the things we build, our cities, our nations, even our lives, will end. But if we live with vision, if we create, teach, and leave behind something greater than ourselves, then collapse is not the end. It is the beginning of someone else's renaissance. In the end, Constantinople teaches us that no civilization is immortal. What matters is not how long you last but the legacy you leave behind. That is the lesson written in fire and blood on the morning of May 29, 1453, and it is a lesson that still speaks to us centuries later. The fall of Constantinople was more than the end of an empire. It was the sound of an age collapsing, stone walls shattered by thunder, prayers drowned by cannon fire, and 1,000 years swallowed in a single dawn. Yet history is not finished. Every fall is only one chapter in a much larger story. Because Constantinople is not the only city that fell with thunder and fire. Beyond the Bosphorus, beyond the shadow of the crescent moon rising over Hagia Sophia, lies another siege, another night where courage, betrayal, and fate conspired to decide the destiny of nations. And when we return, we'll step into that battlefield, where the echoes of Constantinople live on in a story just as gripping, just as tragic, and just as unforgettable. But before you go, remember this. If you leave without subscribing, these forgotten truths vanish again. They sink back into silence, buried like the last emperor of Byzantium beneath the stones of his fallen city. Don't let history die twice. Subscribe, share, and keep the flame alive. The walls of Constantinople may have crumbled, but the walls of memory still stand, and with you they will not fall.